Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today at our second ABP research conversation, where we are looking to present the amazing research that is taking place at our faculty, as we look forward to sharing it with our alumni and the wider community through these online conversations. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this meeting is taking place, which might be multiple lands, of course, given the location of all of you today. And I would like to pay my respect to these owners, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present today. Today, we will be hearing from Professor Mark STEVENSON on his research into the future shape of our cities and COVID-19. Professor STEVENSON is the director of the University of Melbourne's Transport, Health and Urban Design Research Lab, THUD for short. This is the research lab that has provided the Victorian government with the modelling tools to shape its COVID-19 roadmap. Through his background as an epidemiologist and professor of urban transport and public health, Mark is uniquely qualified to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on our cities. He has worked on numerous national and international projects that have directly influenced transport policy and has worked with both federal and state governments in Australia and internationally. Mark will be in conversation with Liz MACKEVICIUS, Melbourne practice leader, senior associate and partner at SGS Economics and Planning. An urban planner with over a decade of public policy experience, Liz enjoys the complexity and challenge of regional metropolitan planning. She has contributed to major metropolitan and regional plans, including the Greater Sydney Commission's district plans and land use framework plans for 3 of Melbourne's metropolitan regions. She has also led housing, activity centre and open space projects, developing coherent and evidence-based policies and strategies. Liz's experience in public policy also includes over 7 years in the Victorian state government, where she contributed to a number of significant projects and policy reforms. Before I now hand over to Liz and Mark, a quick reminder to our audience: if you have any questions for our panelists, please submit them through the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of the screen in writing. And after the conversation has concluded, after about 30 or 40 minutes, we will then endeavour to answer as many of your questions as time allows, before we then wrap up at about 1 p.m. Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to now hand over to Mark and Liz. Thank you for joining us today.
Great.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks for that introduction. And welcome, everyone. We're here today to talk about cities and COVID, what it means, what COVID-19 means. We're obviously in a period of significant change at the moment. In Melbourne, we've all breathed a massive sigh of relief at low and zero case numbers, low numbers of mystery cases, and low numbers of active cases and deaths over the recent week in particular. This is in stark contrast to the situation a few months ago when we were facing hundreds of cases, outbreaks, deaths, and a lot of uncertainty. There's been much jubilation, which I'm sure you've all appreciated, those of you in Melbourne, being able to go to the cafes, go to the shops, businesses reopening and spending time with other households. So while it's been an enormous relief to get back on the beers or maybe something a little more higher up the shelf, we also know that life has certainly not gone back to pre-COVID normal. There's still plenty of uncertainty out there. Many of us are still working from home and likely to be for some time. Face masks are a part of everyday life and again, likely to be for some time. Gatherings, socialising and activities that were part of our everyday life are still not 100% back, although some of them are coming back, which is nice to see. Melbourne as a theatre city, major sporting events, it's known for its culture and intimate spaces and bars, restaurants are all still yet to reopen. We were just talking before about the potential to have perhaps 20,000 people at the Boxing Day test, which would probably be a record low crowd, I suspect, having not gone back to the numbers, but in the scheme of things, it's pretty remarkable that it's going to go ahead at all. So travel and tourism, international students in Melbourne, still a long way to go back to a pre-COVID normal in that regard. So as we head towards this COVID normal, we're interested and we're going to talk today about what this does mean for our cities. We've got a couple of themes to cover, how we move around, what it means for how we use our existing infrastructure, what some of the implications for future infrastructure might be, some of the social and behavioural elements of our city, what this uncertain context might mean for public policy development. How do we go about developing public policy in such an uncertain context? And the role of technology. How can technology play a significant role in getting us back to this COVID, or getting to a COVID normal situation? How do we leverage the enormous progress that's been made from a technological perspective recently? But I really want to start today by talking to Mark about the big picture. What does it mean for the shape of our city? Many of us have felt the benefits of remote working. We've had video conferencing. We're coming to you live from South Melbourne and many other places around the country. Cloud file sharing has enabled us to reduce our commutes, increase our flexibility, allowed many people to contemplate lifestyle changes, moving to peri-urban areas, and many of these things are quite positive outcomes. But it's also a number of challenges associated with the work from home, not least of which, with the school closures, students learning from home. But in terms of even the workplace, the sharing of culture and knowledge sharing, those ad hoc conversations that we all miss. So what we do know is that the forces of agglomeration drawing us back into those central areas are very strong. Whilst many of us quite relish the working from home, many of us are certainly craving to get back into the office, at least on a semi-regular basis. And we can see this. Cities have continued to grow throughout history, even when other pandemics have happened, when rents become enormously high in cities, there is still an enormous pull of people towards these central locations where they have these ad hoc or relationships and run into people on the street. Office space can also be quite an equaliser. There's a series of things which are pulling people into the city, but for those of you, and I'm sure there are some out there who are working from a bedroom or working from a crowded space at home, I'm sure you're more than keen to get back into the office as well. So Mark, tell us, I'm interested in your thoughts. What do you see as the future of our CBDs in particular? Is this just a little blip? Are we going to look back on this and wonder what all the fuss was about? Or do you think there's something more significant that's perhaps going on right now?
Look, thanks, Liz, and terrific introduction. Yeah, I mean, I'll certainly answer your question. Is this a blip or is it something really significant? And I think the answer is probably a bit of both, if I want to take the middle ground. If you think historically, I mean, our cities are a product of constant sort of forces at play. And in many instances, those forces are very constant, steady forces, and cities adapt to them on a day-to-day basis. But those forces can be incredibly abrupt, as we're observed with COVID-19 and other sort of disasters as well. And if we look historically, I mean, that has been the case, for hundreds of years. And if we just put our lens very much around pandemics, we have seen, quite a catastrophic change in Europe particularly, but also with the Spanish flu in terms of how it influenced our early planning in Australia as well. But also the other causes of pandemics, which is the smallpox and the plague and the like, which are all arose around the 1800s and 1850s, and had direct consequence, not only as we're observing in COVID-19 on huge fatality rates and huge disruption in terms of how we went about our day-to-day living in a city, but importantly, it had really significant ramifications on how we looked at our cities for the future. And so back then, we saw the types of design that Paris has now, those massive avenues, and leafy avenues, and sewerage systems that were implemented in the UK and in London in particular, all direct outcomes of these massive forces at play that were due to the pandemic. So I think we are in the same flux today with COVID-19, and that those forces are very strong, and we could see it as a blip and dismiss it to some extent, or we could actually say, no, this is a very significant impact in terms of our urbanisation and urban form in our cities and our CBDs, and we need to take it and make significant inroads here. It's a disruption that is a good disruption for us to make change that is much more on the pathway to sustainability and safety and ultimately, a great response in terms of climate change as well. So I see, when I'm saying it's a blip or somewhere in between, I'm probably erring much more towards saying, let's take this and embrace this as a significant blip, and let's embrace what we can take from this, like our forebearers did in relation to making significant changes around sewage systems and that, and let's do the same here. And that applies very much in the CBD.
That's an interesting point that you raise, and I think that particularly the climate change side of things. So maybe we'll just unpick that a little bit in terms of what some of the opportunities might be. I guess, from an urban form perspective, we're seeing, we've seen people when we had our 5K bubbles, that people were just traveling less. We were forced to, and so people were really building these quite strong bonds in local communities and becoming far more attached to their local barista, perhaps, than the one in the CBD. Yeah. And I think that sense of kind of the local consumption economy on our local high streets and supporting those local business owners, that sort of sense of localism has really been quite a strong theme so far through what we've seen, and obviously with the opening up. I'm interested in whether you think that will be something that's sustained, or whether, there's this kind of economies of scale opportunity around, accessing a range of other services and facilities across the city, but also that sense of localism. And do you think that that's, a key element of the sustainability response, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, terrific question again, Liz. And I think it is, I think we're going to get variation across the city based on that. And I think that reflects whether people can actually work from home legitimately and be productive and effective and have the facilities to do so. So there's sort of in some instances here, social inequalities are playing out where you often in the higher SES areas, socioeconomic areas, there is the facility to be able to do that. And that in a sense fosters community resilience, local community resilience, and will build, a real resurgence of the local high street to some extent. But that's not going to be played out across the whole agglomeration of our cities, because it is, I think, quite dependent on economics and where you do need to perform the activity or your workplace. So it's going to be varied. So we can't sort of say, yes, that's going to happen and we're going to see this massive resurgence in our local areas. I think there will be pockets of that occurring, but I think it won't be homogeneous across the city. And I think what we're seeing as a consequence of COVID-19 as well are the social disparities that are being played out. They're being played out not only in terms of who's contracting the epidemic, who's most affected by the epidemic, but it's also being played out by our urban form as well. Those who have there's public transport's not sufficient for them to use, those who have to work 24/7 or are required to be put at risk based on their jobs as a cleaner or whatever, and also we're seeing some of the cultural elements as well in terms of where people live and how they live, all being played out. And I think it's a real microcosm of all the challenges that we see in terms of managing an epidemic is being played out in terms of how we have to manage our cities nowadays in the 21st century. It's not, we don't sort of I don't believe we can just put out a blueprint and say, here it is. Now, we'll build like that and you live there like that. It doesn't work like that now. And I think that's the sort of shake-up we're getting from COVID-19. There's a much greater urgency to start beginning to resolve the challenges that we've known about, which are housing affordability, which are, being able to provide sufficient housing, be able to provide opportunities for work in local areas as well. So there's a whole array of challenges that have come to the fore as a consequence of this.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a very pertinent point around it's almost in some ways amplifying or reinforcing some of the inequalities that we have in our cities already. And you only have to think about, access to open space as one kind of element of that. And, the higher amenity areas that have these lovely kind of local parks are certainly seeing them be very busy, but those areas that have poor access to that kind of thing. And I think, we could spend a whole seminar talking about the Northcote Golf Course. Event that's going on, I suppose. One thing I'm interested in, I suppose, is around, you talked about housing affordability and having local access to work as, some of the ways that we can overcome the sustainability component and the inequality component. But I'm interested to talk a little bit about the role of technology as well in perhaps overcoming some of those inequality issues, but also, we were talking before about managing COVID in our cities. And I saw an article the other day where someone's developed an app that allows people to virtually queue at shops. So there's sort of, we're reducing that congestion around in shops and in shopping centres perhaps. So interested in your views on how technology might, we might leverage the technology that we have and kind of what's happening in that area at the moment as well.
Look, a great question, Liz, too. We are in, prior to COVID-19, I guess the big disruption we kept talking about in terms of urban form, and it was, the digital disruption. Should we be even referring to it as a disruption? And we really, I think we need to be incredibly proactive about digital and digitalization and see it as the great enabler. And I think what's come to attention for me during this period of COVID-19 is the challenges we see, where I think pockets of our cities have embraced digitalization. But it's pockets again, and there's this inequality that's pervasive in our cities. And I think it was quite pertinent that we were challenged with contact tracing, for example. And I may not be 100% correct on this, but my understanding is that the digital elements of contact tracing still haven't been utilized to the extent they ought to. And I can see how industry are sort of stepping up in a big way and leading in this area. And as you highlighted in that Age article, the commercial shopping centres have initiated approaches there. But the challenge we have with this is, if you think through, that's a great initiative using sort of, I think it was heat sensing, picking up on the heat images in shopping centres to pick up where people were queuing. But if you think about the shopping centres and cafes in Melbourne in themselves, you may go in this COVID normal period now, where you may go into a cafe and they will ask you to document, your name and your phone number. Others may have a QR code, which you'll scan with your phone. And there are variations on the theme in relation to that, depending on what the facility in that cafe may choose to have, whether the proprietor is really quite digitally enhanced or whether they're not. And that is a challenge for us in terms of managing a COVID normal state, because you are using paper and pen, you're using digital, you have if you do actually come in contact with potentially somebody who is positive, then it's very difficult to pull all of that together in a systematic way and really quickly, when it shouldn't be, if we had standardized processes. So what I'm seeing in terms of the digital world and particularly CBDs is that there needs to be a much stronger governance structure around adopting digital platforms to enable us to live now in a COVID normal environment. So these are the opportunities I really keen to discuss in more depth as well, where we should see this as a significant change to how we operated pre-COVID. And that means we need much stronger governance, and we need much stronger direction around our digital platforms in cities, our communication platforms in cities, and particularly, how we deliver our transport systems in cities now. So, we've got a big challenge ahead of us, but it's really exciting phase, because it's a phase of digital enablement. And I think that's key, because it will deliver. There's a whole bunch of constraints with that, and we can talk about, you know, confidentiality and personal protection and the like, but it's happening in a lot of fields, and I think it's one that city governance and the urban governance area really needs to begin to embrace.
Let's pick up on the transport side of things there, Mark. It's part of your background as well, and I'm keen to delve into that in a little bit more detail. So you'd have talked about, you know, we need some stronger governance, but the digital transport side of things. And, you know, in terms of how we move around the city, obviously there's, you know, lots of concern at the moment. I've seen articles about predicting and have also experienced increased traffic on the road because people are unlikely to take up public transport in the way that it was used previously. We've seen the City of Melbourne, we've seen the state government roll out investments in active transport pretty quickly. They've, you know, to be honest, they have responded reasonably quickly in some of those places. But, you know, from your perspective, what do you see as the real opportunities there in terms of the future of like transforming our transport network? Or is it, I guess the question is it a transformation? Is it somewhat more incremental? Is it, you know, the fundamentals of the infrastructure? Or is it more about kind of how the system is run?
All of the above. so look, it's COVID-19 has brought a transformation in transport. It certainly has, and it has globally. Our research lab is looking at, you know, transport, how we've defined cities based on their transport systems, and looking at air pollution, for example. And there's clear evidence now that, you know, we're seeing quite reduced levels of air pollution as a consequence of a modal shift in cities as a consequence of COVID. So it's certainly a transformation. And I guess it's what I see here is, again, it's sort of going back historically, we need to seize the day, you know, carpe diem almost. Let's seize the day and make the change, because, you know, I just dropping my son off at school today. It was so prevalent. Cycling was so prevalent. You know, the kids were not riding to school like they are riding to school now on bikes. So there is an opportunity there that we don't want to lose. So because active transport is going to deliver in highly dense cities in a significant way, and we've seen it. We've done, our research lab's done an enormous amount of work on this to show the sort of not only the health code benefits associated with it, but there's certainly the climate benefits associated with it as well. So I think there's a potential now with this transformation for us to be able to repurpose our road infrastructure, and our road infrastructure in cities is, you know, it's a government investment, it's a public asset, and it needs to deliver. That public asset needs to deliver for the people in terms of transport. And what we've seen here is a modal shift. I can't tell you exactly how much it's moved, but there is a move towards to walking and cycling. So we need to deliver infrastructure as the City of Melbourne's doing. But we're also seeing a significantly increased use of micromobility. And if you think prior to COVID-19, you know, the last mile and the first mile were always substantial challenges in our transport system. But micromobility really does enhance our ability to integrate our transport system network so that we can cover those first mile and the last miles of journeys. And we're seeing a significant uptake of that in terms of the e-bikes and the e-scooters, and not only just they can be, you know, human, you know, powered, you know, scooters as well. But I think that we need to seize as well. And there's a, you know, a game you can play there, you know, and sort of say, oh, they're not safe, they shouldn't be advocated. Or we could say, let's embrace what COVID has actually brought now, and let's redesign how we deliver our transport system for high dense cities like Melbourne. And I'm certainly of that, the latter, that we've got this opportunity. Let's ensure we can deliver those journeys in the safest and most sustainable way. So we should be advocating for e-bikes and e-scooters as much as we can. So that's happening as well. And I think the other key element of all of that discussion on transport as a consequence of COVID-19 is that major road infrastructure particularly, has a long gestational period. You know, it can be in the planning for 10 years. And all of a sudden we have this significant disruption that has actually now changed our mobility statistics overnight. should we be then delivering, massive road infrastructure, billions and billions of dollars, in the same way as we, assuming that it was all going to continue for the next 50 years, the same way as it has in the past 50? My answer to that is no, we shouldn't. I don't think we should be doing that. We need to rethink what we're doing. And if we've got $1 billion, let's work through our infrastructure and how to best deliver it in the most sustainable and efficient manner for the public. So those are points, I'm covering quite a number there, but I think they're really important points, particularly for planners and city governance around delivery of our infrastructure.
I think there's there'll be many questions that people will have to delve further into that. And I guess, one thing to just kind of tie it back into the inequality question as well. I mean, in dense inner city areas, certainly even e-bikes and e-scooters, but just normal bikes, normal scooters, walking are, a 10-minute or 20-minute journey will give you access to a whole range of jobs and services. But certainly in some of those areas, which are, those middle and outer ring suburbs where the journey has, like, up until this point, has to be in the car. Any thoughts or reflections on sort of how we can, help address inequality with the changes in transport that you're observing, how we can kind of use that to help us address some of those inequality issues in those outer areas?
Yeah, look, that's always been a challenge, but I think what I would say here is that there's a glitch just for a short period of time in relation to our public transit. Our public transit is the backbone of a robust city and economy. It's equivalent to sort of the blood, the veins and the arteries running through your body. It's the lifeblood of a city. So we've got to continue to invest in that public transit to ensure we can get people, from the outer peri-urban areas into areas where there is opportunity and employment. And I think what I would say is that we continue, that public transport will come back. It's already operating in a COVID safe manner. I've done some research on this, and we don't know of one case that has been transmitted as a consequence of traveling on public transport. So there are, as long as we're wearing masks, that public transport is safe, it's being cleaned, there's entry from buses from the rear now, and so we're reducing crowding. So all of the practices are in place. So it will come back, and it will continue to deliver. I think what I would be keen to see is that we provide those last mile, the links to the public transport that are now provided using e-bikes or e-scooters in a sustainable, clean fashion, so that it's not reliant on having to create massive car parks near train stations so that everyone can drive and hop on the train, that there are alternatives, even if it is shared Uber trips or whatever, that could be subsidized by public transport to ensure that it connects up to those more isolated areas. And those are sort of policies that need to be to prioritize, I think, the sort of more vulnerable in our population, to ensure that they do have access, because in the absence of that, we're going to have significant challenges in the city.
I just want to go back to the public transport thing. I guess, something that I've been thinking about, and are the days of cramming onto trains and trams, like literally jamming people on there. I noticed you said that there hasn't been a case of COVID transmission on public transport that we're aware of, but surely those days are sort of well behind us, for at least until there's a vaccine in our cities.
Yeah, look, that is the case, and we know that is going to be a challenge. Again, the mask wearing is really important, but nonetheless, we cannot go with incredibly densely populated trams and trains. So we have that challenge. And I guess the other point I do want to, and it's probably more of a negative, is that the COVID normal environment is going to be with us for a long time. It's unlikely we're going to see a vaccine at least until the latter part of next year. And then we have to understand just how much, what is the policy in Australia and elsewhere in relation to the delivery of that vaccine, and how efficacious is the vaccine. We don't know that yet, but the WHO are indicating that they potentially would even consider accepting a vaccine efficacy level of about 50%. So that's pretty low. So, you give, if you, let's say you're going to vaccinate all those over 65 years and you get 75% uptake of that, and the vaccine's only 50% efficacious, then, you're still seeing large numbers of the population who will have no, antigen for the vaccine. And so it's not necessarily the panacea that it gets placed. The vaccine comes in and life's back to normal.
Yeah.
I think that's why this is a really important conversation, because we do need to focus on the future here and focus on the significant interruption that will allow us to now replan and rethink how we operated our big agglomerations.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said earlier in my opening remarks, obviously in Melbourne, we're all quite excited to be back out, but there's still a long way to go. And as you said, we probably just need to temper our expectations a little about how quickly that might happen. And certainly seeing colleagues interstate, the impact that it's had, it seems to be declining in terms of the impact that it's having on everyday life there, with the exception of, I guess, still having not full crowds at major sporting events, inside in offices, obviously being, spending extended periods of time inside, obviously quite problematic compared to outdoor events.
Yeah, it is. And even all kids sport, even outside, it's dramatically changed, so it's certainly a challenge moving forward, and but one that Australia has been we've been highly successful. I mean, there's a lot of criticism about our COVID and our roadmap out in Melbourne. I just would like us to all celebrate just how bloody successful we've been as a whole, not just Melbourne, not just Victoria, but actually Australia as a whole. And I think it is a good indication of some of the resilience we have had operating in our country and in our cities for some time. And I think that's a really important. We've invested in that.
Yeah.
And I think we can actually step out of this and lead to the next stage. And I think that, it's interesting, maybe the naysayers in relation to how the government, our state government, have actually handled this, had really said it's crippling the economy. And yet, when you look at the economics of other cities that haven't gone the same way as us, they have not succeeded to the extent at all that everyone assumes that if you open up, the economy will take off again. So, it's a little bit more complex than just saying open everything up and everything continues on, because it's not going to happen like that.
Yeah, and I guess there's, the individual decision making around that as well, and people's nervousness about being perhaps exposed in certain locations. I mean, I think it's interesting you talk about, Australia and Melbourne's leadership in that regard. And, certainly one of the things we've been thinking about is obviously the impact on international students in Melbourne is significant, and international tourism, huge, massive impacts in that sector. But if you think about, and likely to continue for quite some time, but then I guess the flip side is if you think about, if you're a student contemplating whether or not, and this is probably, if not next year, possibly the year after, contemplating where you might go to study, looking at Australia's response compared to what's happening in Europe and in the US at the moment, I mean, you'd have to say that it's a fairly positive picture in that regard. So
exactly. Yeah. It's how you spin it. It's how you spin it. But it is. Nonetheless, I mean, we're not, we need to acknowledge it's been a significant hit. I mean, gosh, I'm in the university sector, and it's, billions of dollars. So it's a very tough time. But yes, there is a positive we can spin on this too, in terms of when we come out and what we can market and promote. And if we really focus on our digital opportunities as well, we can make quite a lot from this. I'm not talking financially, but in terms of how you live with a COVID normal and safe, environment.
Just want to change tack. This is probably the last little point that we might talk about, and we might open it up for some questions. But, You mentioned governance, and I think, you know, how public policy is developed in this incredibly complex and fast-moving environment. I know you've had some experience in giving some advice around the modelling about, you know, what some of the scenarios might look like. But I'm interested in your thoughts around, like, how does government kind of respond? Governments are notoriously risk-averse and fairly slow-moving, and, you know, that when forced to move quickly, well, shall we say there's some outcomes that are probably not desirable happen. So, you know, how do you think governments need to, I guess, think about that, you know, policy development task in this quite complex, fluid, dynamic environment?
Yeah. By embracing the complexity that we're living in now. And what I mean by that is understanding that that most of our phenomenon that we're observing are no longer sort of linear phenomenon. They are dynamic, and they have multiple elements that need to be observed. And I think one of the reasons why we're probably being successful in assisting with the government with the roadmap out for COVID-19 is that we applied a behavioural model to the epidemiology, which allowed us to say, well, this is what we're observing in the community in terms of how people are responding and how they're behaving. And if you start influencing this policy, you're likely to get these sorts of changes and these restrictions. And we began to model it in a way where you could observe that, and it could give you some tangible outcomes. So what that highlights to me is that it's starting to begin to explore this notion of complexity and just how challenging cities are, and that there are a whole array of negative externalities that are associated with public policy, just as much as there are positive outcomes from such policy. And I think in the COVID normal state and public policy making, I believe, for the next few years, we need to be able to look at an array of those elements and begin to explore what will happen if we do this, and what potentially could happen, and how do we co-design a lot of what we're proposing. I think you know, we've given the public and the community you know, very little say in terms of how we best design our policies or public focus, or even our public realm, to the extent that it ought to be given. And I think what we can see what we ought to be seeing with public policy, I think, over the next 2 and more years, is that we co-design with the community. And not wait for a 3 to 4 year cycle in terms of mayoral candidates, but engage on an ongoing basis, so that we can begin to see what the community are desiring and need, and also what we can provide to ensure that it has impact not only on our transport system, but on our housing and on the health, you know, that we're facilitating, or the health outcomes that we desire. So I think there's a whole array of ways we can couch our public policy that we haven't really done in the past, and that is embracing the complexity of our cities, our 21st century cities, that are not linear beasts. They are multiple interactions. I think I'm getting the point across. I think it's a very I think a different mindset, and I think this is again goes back to that first question you asked about, you know, is it a blip or is it a significant interruption? It's a significant interruption if we want to ensure that we take it on board, and this applies to public policy. It applies to how we deliver our transport. It applies to how we deliver our health systems, and I think the way we've positioned ourselves in Australia, I think we're really well positioned to do that, to take it on as a significant disruption.
Yeah, and look, I think you pick up on some interesting threads that are sort of coming through there in terms of, you know, we're seeing increased deliberative democracy type approaches in terms of, you know, that citizen engagement and the idea of sharing the dilemma.
Yeah.
You know, it's the evidence-based side of things, informed by the technology that you talked about as well, in terms of, you know, we have like sort of almost, you know, immediate data coming through, and if, you know, the governance around that, then it can kind of inform policy in that regard. But
Yeah.
Plenty of interesting topics there. I'm just going to get throw back to Simon, who I think has been collecting some of our audience questions there, Simon.
That's correct, yes. And firstly, thanks so much to you and Liz and Mark for such an insightful conversation. And we have indeed received a few questions, and I might begin with maybe the more general ones, if you want. One of the questions we have received is you've spoken about how people are now more connected to their suburban high street by default somewhat because they have to stay at home. Given the general lack of high street strips in many suburban developments since the 1970s, how do we retrofit these suburbs so that we better enable the daily interactions associated with meeting human needs and scales? And I guess that would be a question for the two of you.
Liz, you'd be good for that.
Look, it's a challenging question, and there's no doubt about it that, that sort of organic high street based retail has in a lot of locations been overtaken by shopping centres. But I do think that there are some in the growth, some parts of the growth areas, and I know that the VPA, through their PSP guidelines, have been really trying quite hard and been successful in some cases in terms of creating at least a diversity of those activities and integrating community spaces into those new centres. I think what we're seeing in both in all types of kind of local activity centres is that there's a shift as well away from it just being about retail goods, and it's much more about experiences and services, and that's personal services, but it's things like gyms and childcare and all that sort of stuff is now going into centres. So it's really becoming those community focal points that people visit regularly. So I think it's not a straightforward answer, but I think there are kind of ways that it can be done in a reasonably successful way.
Thank you, Liz. Another question that we have received relates to, I think, a thread that has come through in several of your answers, which relates to the spatial inequality, which of course is very much present. I guess this might be too big a question to answer, maybe, but we are aware that this certainly is that this spatial inequality exists. What could be done to address it, and maybe keeping in mind against the backdrop of potentially changed migration patterns, and that the growth of Melbourne will change in future years? How is there in what ways could we address that kind of spatial inequality? A big one, arguably.
No, look, I mean, that's a really good question, and I know Liz will be able to answer better than I in some regards, and that it just makes me think about some of the research that we have been doing focused around the health co-benefits of compact cities. And so really looking to see whether densification really does assist in sort of, in some ways reducing some of that spatial inequality, so that we don't have the sprawling suburbs that have, very limited facilities and access to amenities and the like. And there's been quite a bit of literature written about the compact city in terms of both, positive and negative. And it's interesting that when we assess that just recently in relation to COVID-19, the perception you would have assumed was that the compactness, so those cities that are not sort of so spatially dispersed, the Hong Kongs and the Taipeis and the like, probably you would have thought they may not have done so well given the intense densification in terms of potential for transmission. But on the contrary, they delivered much better than they have, the sprawling outer suburban type cities. And really what it came down to when we looked at that, we were quite surprised. And it really came down again to governance. How did the governance in those cities, how did they respond to the disruptor being COVID? And if they responded proactively with all of the citizens in mind, they seem to have a better, certainly curtailed the transmission. So I guess I'm saying one answer to some of the spatial inequalities is the level of governance that we have in our cities and how best to deliver that to ensure that we can sort of break down some of that inequality generally, but also particularly some of the spatial inequality, should we continue to just open the peri-urban areas and continue to allow, growth, is a really important question that we need to ask ourselves for the next 10 years, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would add to that, and I think, if we're thinking about spatial inequality, it's about choices people have in terms of access to a whole range of services and facilities, and key amongst that is employment. So it's not necessarily the location of employment, it's also about the access that people have to that. So I think, as we've talked about earlier, leveraging the transport system to really make the most of where those jobs are and making it people being able to have choices about where they access those jobs is a huge part of that. I would also, suggest in thinking about the location of things like childcare and, some sort of less spatial policies around subsidisation of childcare in terms of, making that labour market a little bit more open so that people can access those jobs. I think it's also, in addressing inequality, it is around housing choices, and people make all sorts of sort of different decisions based on their circumstances about where they want to live and what sort of trade-offs they're willing to make. But certainly from an affordability perspective, that spatial inequality is driven to such a large degree by the type of housing and the location, because it then ties back to the location of those those services that people have access to.
Thank you. We have received a couple of questions that I guess relate to in how far policy can influence our behaviors as we move out of the COVID crisis. One question is in regards to whether we might be moving closer to having some sort of road pricing or congestion tax potentially to make sure we don't have everybody on the road. Would that actually change behavior? Another question is in regards to some local governments conceiving free parking schemes. Would that bring people back to wherever we want them to be? In an early conversation between the three of us, we had also spoken about what impact it might have if the government was to change or lower public transport fees, for example. What do you think? What kind of impact can those, I guess, if you want, monetary policies have on people's behavior?
Well, good question. I mean, we know, in fact, we just finished undertaking at the research lab a randomized trial looking at if you reward or penalize drivers, does that financially, does that have an impact on how they drive in terms of safety? And it clearly did. And in fact, we found actually penalizing. So if you give $200, let's say, and if they start exceeding speed limits and the like, they would lose some of that money. If there was some penalty to that behavior, there seemed to be a better response to change. So we know that there are, and even with nudge theory, there are now ways of actually using, particularly digitally enhanced feedback to influence behaviours. So we know that. And so there's certainly a whole bunch of approaches around car parks that influences drivers' desire to come to an area or not. And so it's not necessarily always about, providing car parks. In fact, removing car parks has had significant influence on the desirability of cities as a consequence. And so just as one example, the city of I'm trying to think where it is now. I can't remember now. In Norway, I think, or maybe Oslo. I think it's Oslo. Was saying it basically wanted to ban cars by 2020 from the CBD, and there was just a significant outcry, and they weren't successful in achieving it. But what they were able to do was to limit the parking facilities, particularly on-street parking. And what they did find is that dramatically changed the numbers of vehicles passing through the city, and as a consequence, it increased active transport. But importantly, it boosted the economy as well. So there's often a perception determined that you remove those vehicles and you'll have significant impact on the economics of the high streets and the like. And that didn't play out there. So we know that those are particularly good levers. Parking is a good lever. We can influence behaviours using transport policies, but they don't always have to be, I think, some of the ones you've just highlighted, I think are particularly quite draconian ones, like, you know, road pricing and the like, because I don't think they're necessary to provide an equitable playing field in terms of access. So there are opportunities, but again, it's about ensuring that they are ones that are likely to have good implications for the city as a whole, and also for the environment, and also for health. I think those are sort of my key lenses that I look through.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to that in terms of sort of the road pricing thing. I mean, that's a significant kind of source potentially of inequality, particularly where there aren't any alternatives to private vehicle travel. I mean, I think in my mind, you know, just thinking through people's immediate behavioural response, I suspect it's been to drive more than people perhaps were previously, rather than public transport. I mean, we've certainly seen a large uptake of active transport, but for those who aren't able to do that or access that, car travel, I mean, I think it's a big risk that continues now. And, you know, I have seen some, you know, people advocating for more car parking, more free car parking in central city areas. And I think that is a huge risk. And, you know, we're at this point right now where if we kind of, that would almost be winding back the clock in terms of some of the progress that's been made. So, you know, I think it's about kind of sharing positive experiences where car parking has potentially been reduced and more active transport modes have been provided for, and the positive economic outcomes that have been seen. It's, you know, the impact that it has on the amenity of a local place is really significant if we're talking about, you know, dual carriageway roads versus cycle lanes and you know, more pedestrian friendly environment. So I think, you know, it's perhaps about demonstrating that in some ways, because I think otherwise there's a significant risk that we turn back the clock in terms of our car-based approach to planning.
Thank you. I think we might stick for a minute with that topic of patterns of behavior. There are another couple of questions that have come through on that topic. These ones are more about we now have developed our new habits. We had to live within our 5K bubble for quite a while. We're comfortable. We're hopefully reasonably comfortable within that bubble. We're now using more of our high street suburban shopping streets. What happens now? Let's say, is there a point where we might just revert back to old habits, and how can government deal with that kind of added level of complexity? Let's say now we can travel 25 kilometers. Will we head back to the CBD if we cannot desert our local shopping malls? Or is the appearance of a vaccine the trigger point where we return back to the CBD? I guess from your perspective, how likely is it that we'll stick with our newly found habits, or are we just going to revert back at some stage? And how can government work with that complexity? You would want to be in a situation where you're a local council, you make all these changes to accommodate people's change in habits, and then in a year or two, they revert back to the old habits.
Yeah, I mean, I hope not, Simon. I think that I think that what we've observed is that it's demonstrated that, you know, working remotely can work. As I said earlier, like there are some downfalls with it, some sort of downsides to it, but it is possible to run these sessions and to run workshops and to run team meetings and to run all sorts of things remotely. And I think that, you know, we've had to deal with that for the last 7 months. So I suspect that will be a continuing thing that we'll see, whether or not, and I think that will flow through to people wanting to spend more time working at home. There's certainly lots of surveys that have been done that have suggested that people now are far more interested in working from home at least a couple of days a week. people, I think, also acknowledge that there are certainly very compelling reasons to come into the office and to see people. So I think what we'll see is that rather than having like a place where you live and a place where you work, there will be a place where you live and there will be several places potentially where you work. It might be that you want to have some space which is not in your kitchen or in your living room, but you are interested, like, because you can work remotely, then maybe it is some of the co-working space in the local centre. So I do see that there's been a shift there, and that, that's part of how we kind of keep reinvigorating some of our local centres as well. But yeah, the longer term impacts on behaviour, we'll have to wait and see on that one, I think.
Yeah, I think that's terrific responses. I think, it's been 7 months, and I think, as I've alluded to, we will be seeing a 2021 in the same vein. No, we haven't eliminated in New South Wales or in Victoria, and we will continue with sort of aggressive suppression. So that means we'll be living in this COVID normal certainly next year and beyond, potentially. So when does it become a habit? I'd say, potentially if we continue with this, it will remain. I'm hopeful it will remain, because I think the spin-offs from this are, one, of sustainability, two, in terms of potential benefits in terms of our climate, and three, I think it's incredibly productive, and I think ultimately we will see, I think, a resurgence of our local economies more. The CBD may change, but I think we probably see what Liz highlighted too, local co-working spaces sort of becoming much more vibrant and providing an opportunity for innovation as well. So not entirely localized as in terms of the CBD. So there's going to be opportunities then for us to also rethink, how do we leverage what's in the CBD now with some of the space as well. So I actually think it's an incredibly exciting time, and I just hope we don't lose the momentum. And I guess what I want to ensure that what we're getting from this conversation too is that it will require people like ourselves really advocating for that change now, to really say this is not a blip, this is a significant disruption, and it's going to be an incredibly valuable disruption. And now let's make the most of it, right through from our governance and our public policy, right through to our day-to-day work practices. This is it, and let's achieve it.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Liz. I think that's actually a beautiful way to a beautiful note to end on. I'm mindful we still have quite a few questions in the Q&A, and there's some really great questions. And I'm sorry we won't get to all of them today. So I'd like to firstly thank all our audience members today for joining us and for submitting your questions. And I think since it's now approaching 1 p.m., I think we might start to wrap things up. So firstly, thank you once more to Mark and Liz for sharing your expertise and insights today. It was a really insightful conversation, and with so much data and facts, which I think was immensely helpful. Thank you, of course, also to our audience for joining us today, for submitting your questions, and we very much hope you enjoyed this ABP research conversation. If you are interested to find out more about the university's THUD, Transport, Health and Urban Design Research Lab, please visit their website, which includes numerous articles, tools, and models that are publicly accessible. And I will include a link to the THUD website in my follow-up email to this session on Monday. That email will then also include a link to the video recording of this session. So please feel free, of course, to share that recording with friends and colleagues who might be interested in it. So thank you once more to all of you for joining us today, and I hope you'll be with us again next time. Thank you, and have a lovely weekend.
Thanks, everyone.